I'm here really because as Fiona said, I've used several archives. Most recently, I had a couple of months in the Beinecke Special Collections at Yale University Library, where I was looking in particular at the archive of sort of mid-20th century literary figures, and I was trying to explore what their relationship was with broadcasting. They were writers. What did they think of radio and television? And I particularly looked at Langston Hughes and his work for the BBC. And I've also spent some time at the Lilly Library at Indiana University, where I was looking in particular at the work of a BBC producer who was with the BBC in the 1920s right the way through to the 1950s, Lance Sieverking, who was interested in experimental radio. He was a kind of pretty unsuccessful, mediocre writer, but he had a very interesting life as a pilot and so on in the First World War. And his personal collection of letters was there. And also all the scripts for the programmes that people thought no longer existed were lurking there as well. So I was particularly interested in looking at his working copies of his scripts to try and get some sense of how he made his programmes, because the programmes don't exist. They were all live. But most of my research in the archives has been overwhelmingly at the BBC Written Archive Centre in Caversham, a much less glamorous building. But behind that sort of unassuming bungalow on the outer reaches of Caversham Park, there's a really good repository. Now, I was there basically working on a history of Radio 4. And I think it's an extraordinary collection. It looks unprepossessing, as I say, but actually there's about 5 miles of shelving there, millions of documents, and it's basically the working papers of the BBC since 1922. And I think what makes it valuable is that because of the kind of organisation the BBC was, an extraordinary range of British life passed through it. So that in one file, you can, for instance, find memos which are notes of a meeting between someone at the BBC and Margaret Thatcher's press secretary, and memos about a meeting discussing racist jokes on TV light entertainment. So there's this kind of extraordinary mix and span of high culture and low culture. One of the former producers of the BBC, Philip French, who went on to be a very distinguished film critic, once described the BBC as being staffed by bohemians dressed as civil servants. He actually later said that it was becoming an organisation of civil servants disguised as bohemians, but that's beside the point. The advantage of that is that what you have in the archives that are captured in the writing of the archives is a kind of a quite expressive class of people who are kind of expressing and articulating their thoughts and their disputations and so on. But it's minuted with kind of forensic detail because of that kind of civil service ethos as well. So it's an extraordinary resource for that reason. There is an obvious question, I suppose, which was doing a history of Radio 4. You would imagine I would use the sound archives a great deal and listen to lots of programmes. I mean, I did listen to programmes, but actually it was the least interesting part of the research. For me, the programmes are kind of just the end product, the finished product of a very, very long chain of thinking, argument, discussion, and so on about why are we doing this programme? What programme are we trying to create here? What's wrong with it? Who is going to listen to it, and so on. So, I mean, you have kind of, it's full of memos like this. Here is another idea for a series, Desert Island Discs. And then, a memo like that unlocks a whole series of kind of debates and discussions about, why are we doing this? What's the state of the nation, and so on. And some of this kind of feels very sort of grand and comical, but it gives you a sort of ongoing insight into the kind of collective brain of the BBC. And I was kind of much more interested in that chain of thinking, that sort of all the stuff in the iceberg that's below the waterline rather than the programmes themselves. Another reason is revealed by this. This is actually something from the Lilly Library rather than the BBC archives, and it's one of the letters sent to Lance Sieverking by his friend Paul Nash, the painter. They met, they'd signed up and joined the Army, the Artists' Rifles on the same day in 1914, and were then lifelong friends, and indeed spent a lot of time talking about flying. Lance Seaver-King was a pilot. Paul Nash was fascinated by flying but couldn't fly because of asthma. So anyway, they had a close friendship, and this is a kind of letter from Paul Nash where he does this lovely little pen portrait of his friend Lance Seaver-King. A lot of broadcasting history is about structures and institutions and policies and so on. And I am anxious sometimes that we lose sight of the personalities and the individuals who are defining and changing and shifting broadcasting. And I wanted to sort of understand what's the sort of baggage that these individuals bring to the task of broadcasting. What's the kind of world of thought and emotions and experience that they bring to bear? So that sort of hinterland of kind of private life, I think, is part of the story of an institution at the BBC. And I know that there are dangers about overstressing the role of personality and biography and individual agency when we're dealing with big, powerful things like media. But I kind of think there is a sort of strategy here, or at least there was for me, which was, yes, the big story might be about an institution like the BBC and the way it develops over the decades. But once you've got a grasp of what you think that big story, that big institutional structural pattern is, it's very nice, I think, if for no other reason, to kind of find individuals and incidents, fragments of story that can help convey that larger story. So the archive, in a way, allows you to kind of work towards the bigger story, and then it gives you the kind of raw material to humanise it in some way. Well, the obvious challenge, I think, is, confronting a big archive. And I think the important thing is to learn the organisational mind of the institution that you're dealing with. And I suppose a vivid example of this was when I first turned up to the BBC Written Archive Centre, and I'd just been given 2 years research leave. I had 2 years ahead of me of going to the archive to do the history of Radio 4, and I said, just give me all the files you've got on Radio 4. And there was just one file on the desk. One file. I thought, I'm not going to be able to drag this out for 2 years. And I sort of saw the book project crumbling in front of me. And of course, I sort of fairly quickly realised that the problem was that even though we think that Radio 4 exists, organisationally, it doesn't exist for the BBC. Radio 4 is a channel, it's an output, but actually all it is, for much of its history, is just one or two people, the controller and his or her assistant, kind of choosing programmes that are made by production departments. So if you want to kind of reconstruct the history of Radio 4, you actually have to kind of look at everything other than Radio 4, really. You have to look at drama and news and current affairs and various committees and so on. So it's the archive is the working papers left behind by the BBC as it has been structured internally. So getting a handle on the internal structure of the BBC gives you a handle on the shape of the archive and where you're going to find things. So another example is that one of the crude distinctions in the BBC archive is between R files and T files, which stands for radio and television. Now that seems very straightforward, but I've been there in the Written Archive Centre and seen television history researchers sort of leave almost in tears at the kind of disappointment that they find when opening up the television files. And they find things like this, quite interesting. I mean, this isn't actually from a television file, but this is the kind of stuff you get in a kind of regular programme file. It's just a kind of contract for John Peel in 1967. You get kind of contracts or kind of notes about spending money, and you kind of think, well, this is a bit boring, a bit uninteresting. And the reason is because in the BBC, radio is the senior service. So all policy debates that deal with television are to be found in the R files. Okay, so if you want to understand about, for instance, debates about, at a high level, about bad language or taste on Till Death Do Us Part, for instance, then you actually probably need to start looking in the R files to kind of track that down. So it's kind of getting into this sort of slightly strange thing. If you want to know about the Archers, you don't look in R, because even though it's radio that's produced in the Midlands, so you have to look in the M files. If you're interested in documentaries, you probably have to look in the M files from Manchester, because Manchester is the kind of gritty place that does documentaries, and indeed that's where a lot of documentary work is conducted. So you eventually kind of work your way towards where the interesting stuff is. One example of this is the so-called yellow minutes, which are sort of news and current affairs meetings. The yellow minutes I kind of arrived at 9 months later, and they're the minutes of the weekly meetings of the senior news editors with the Director General. So you get this is just a sort of random thing from almost the first one in the series, a discussion about balance in the coverage of Vietnam. And the DG basically thinks that all the kind of lefty news and current affairs people below him have been sort of slightly stressing the pacifist case, and that actually we need to kind of tweak it back the other way. And that's just sort of one little slice out of 1 minute, and these minutes are sort of about 15 pages long every week, so it's almost near sort of verbatim account of the kind of discussions about the coverage of politics, international affairs, and so on. And this is just some examples of the kind of things that are in the R78 policy files that are possibly of interest to people who are interested not just in radio and television history, but in the history of politics or culture in all sorts of ways, about satire, about the Falklands, about Nixon, about Northern Ireland, about political broadcasting, Enoch Powell, the history of women, race relations, religion, Brixton disorders, Solzhenitsyn. There are lots of files about individuals, and indeed one of the kind of things that I neglected to do, and I wish I'd done it earlier, was to go into the stacks themselves. When you go into the stacks, if you can actually have a look at the stacks as a researcher, if the archivist will let you in, then you get a very vivid sense of where the weight of material is in the collection. And I was immediately struck, rather too late in the day, by how much of the archive was about individuals. It was about sort of individual contributors. So if Alexander Solzhenitsyn had ever contributed to the BBC, there was a big collection of stuff related to him and so on. Swearing, Margaret Thatcher, Duke of Windsor. I mean, this is all kind of just stuff that you kind of think, oh, I've got to have a look in that file. So anyway, for me, it's the sort of slow accumulation of detail, really, rather than kind of finding that kind of killer document. Individually, a lot of this didn't amount to stuff, and I think this slow accumulation of detail is interesting because it's a slightly counterintuitive approach to one that we often have with archives, which is about searching. For instance, another completely different example of this is the kind of approach by Lev Manovich in New York, who's not particularly interested in history or archives, but he's interested in using computer software to visualize large amounts of data. And this is his visualization of every cover of Time magazine since it began. And I suppose what he's sort of saying is that there is a virtue and an argument in just sort of not searching and mining, but in standing back and seeing what the big picture is. What are the patterns that are created? What are the trends that are created if you just allow for the slow accumulation of detail? An example from the BBC is what I think is the kind of the single most interesting collection of material, and that's the Weekly Programme Review Board. The Weekly Programme Review Board was where basically programme makers, senior producers and editors, I suppose sort of middle-ranking people in the BBC, would gather around a table with channel controllers and more senior editors, and they would spend 2 hours a week discussing some of the programmes that had been broadcast in the previous week and the issues that arise from them. Editorial issues, public reaction, newspaper reaction. Editorially, was it right? Was it wrong? Do we do more of this? And so on. And again, they're very, very meticulously minuted. Here's an example of just one. This is from 1968, boat race coverage. And it's just a reference here that I thought was, this is one of the first things I saw, about the BBC radio boat not being able to keep up. And then they start moaning about the television boat could keep up, but of course the television coverage was rubbish. The radio coverage was better, but we couldn't keep up. And I thought, well, that's lovely. I really like that, but I don't know what to do with it. I mean, I've just no idea where that fits into a story of Radio 4. There are probably more important things to discuss. History of Women's Hour and whatever. Anyway, So it kind of just gets filed away. But eventually, over time, it's sort of incidents like that that allowed me to understand the ebbs and flows of the BBC's financial crisis, basically. It alerted me to the importance of money in terms of shaping programmes and certain crises at certain times. So eventually, over time, I felt I had a story about the importance of financial crises, which I could tell. And then I went back to that boat race as a kind of way of illustrating the straw in the wind, really, in 1968. So it kind of became something that kind of had to sort of convey in the finished sort of story something more abstract and difficult to grasp, I suppose. A similar example is in Taste and Decency, and I've got some sort of handouts here that I'll just sort of pass around, and then I'm almost done. There's probably not quite enough for one each, so if I just split it in two and give half to each side of the room, just pass them around. These are some extracts from the minutes of a weekly programme review board. And you'll see that in the first 2 pages, no, the first 3, page 1, 2 and 3, are extracts from a document that was circulated to all BBC staff in late 1972, and it's about taste and standards in BBC programmes. This was described in the press as a new aspect of BBC censorship, a new diktat that was being imposed from on high. Anyway, you can kind of get a feel for what that policy statement says about what language, when can we use the word bloody? What about the most extreme language? What happens then? Obviously, we've got to use it sometimes, because if it's got artistic merit and so on, then we have to reserve the judgment. So no words were banned, but the rules about when you could use certain words were sort of being codified, really, for the first time. The BBC did not like having a code about language for various reasons. Now you look at that and you think of that's the sort of the tip of the iceberg, that's the finished product, and understood by the external world as a kind of one-off bit of censorship that comes from nowhere. But if you look through the weekly programme review board, you can start to see a sort of rising arc of anxiety about language. So, for instance, just as an illustration, if you go to page 4 onwards, you've got an extract from a weekly programme review board from earlier that year. I included the discussion of the Today programme because I thought that would be quite interesting. But the one that's really relevant to the issue of language is on page 7, which is a discussion of a play called The Brother of the Bride. And there's an interesting discussion there about the kind of language, and it's about sex. Is it about sex? No, it's about class. That's why people didn't like it. They're okay with sex, but class is a real problem. It's Danish, so it's dangerously foreign. And, should it be on Radio 4 or should it be on Radio 3? Radio 3, you can just about have anything goes on Radio 3, but Radio 4, that's not quite as simple. So there are all these discussions, and just week after week after week, month after month, year after year, you get a kind of a sense of the collective brain at work, I think. Okay, some concluding thoughts then. Basically that 1972 policy document is a kind of end point rather than a beginning. And it tells you something about the kind of functioning of the BBC. The BBC is not an organisation that entirely is top-down. There are certain things that kind of bubble away in the lower ranks. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes the decision-making kind of filters up. And there's a story around this, and one of the stories about this, which I won't go into, is that the BBC were basically collectively deciding at this point they were not going to fight on 2 fronts. They were under pressure from the government about Northern Ireland, and they were under pressure about sex and bad language, and they basically decided we're going to fight in terms of Northern Ireland, we'll give in terms of sex and language. Anyway, okay, so final point then. I sort of was slightly fearful about Oxford University Press sort of marketing the book as a definitive history of Radio 4, because, as we all know, it's never definitive. But more than not being definitive, I think that probably, my own rough estimate is that I probably looked at about 10% of what I thought I was going to look at. So this is an example of the yellow minutes, the R3s. This is my list to get through, and I think sort of pretty well late on I'd just ticked off 2 of them. It's terrible, isn't it? It is. It's terrible. I mean, there's just a vast amount of stuff. It's possible I did dip into 1 or 2 others, but basically, the only way I could cope with this vast amount of material was by a process of slicing, really. And I think I tried to do 2 types of slicing. A horizontal slice, where I basically said, well, I'm trying to convey the breadth of Radio 4, and therefore I'm not going to get bogged down in news and current affairs. I want to make sure I look at drama, I look at comedy, I look at sport, I look at children, I look at all these things. So I want to kind of look, and I want to look at the regions and so on. So I have to kind of slice it that way, and just sort of like a drill extracting kind of rock or something. I just had to sample through news and current affairs and drama and so on, but also to slice vertically. There is a temptation to go straight for the really big, important policy documents from the top of the organisation, because that really does give you the big picture. You know the stuff. You can chart the big stories. But I think it's also really important to kind of try and think of some mid-level stuff and some kind of low-level stuff, really, and try and get a feel for the different layers of an organisation. And of course, it's all kind of psychologically traumatising being in an archive. It's lovely and pleasurable, but the anxiety, I suppose, that you'll all know about is, what am I missing? My only strategy for this was to kind of split my effort, and I'd basically spend the mornings plodding systematically through my favourite bits of archive, the bits that I felt were just forming the spine of my story. So it was the weekly programme review board above all, because it felt like the kind of the beating heart of the organisation. And then I'd kind of, after lunch, I'd just go scampering about through random, and it was the pleasure of not finding stuff that lifted my spirits in the afternoon. Excellent. There's nothing in that folder. that is a very, very reassuring part of archival research. So anyway, thank you very much. And the only thing, just as a sort of last thought, really, is that in the end, I think that the key skill with archives is to keep your nerve. Don't panic when nothing turns up, I think. Later on in the process, you'll be pleased that nothing turns up. But even in the early stages, I think the expectation of finding a kind of a golden bullet document is sometimes debilitating. But actually, for me at least anyway, it's the slow accumulation of details. And that allows you, towards the end, to retrospectively reassess some of those fragments. Those isolated stories about the boat race, for instance, become important means of telling the story. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I think I have to ask, we're going to have questions about it afterwards, but Chair's prerogative, I have to ask, did the boat ever catch up?
No, I mean, the finances got kind of worse and worse, basically. Obviously, of course, part of the story that you're getting here is it's the weekly programme review board for radio. So it's full of people basically saying, you know what, television's rubbish, and we do things far better. That panorama, dreadful. Pile on 4, brilliant. And so, occasionally you do have to step out of that bubble. So it is important to look at, I found myself having to look at the weekly programme review board for television in order to get that, that File on 4 on radio was terrible, panorama, brilliant. So there's a kind of, there's special pleading going on here. Again, you're not taking everything at face value.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. Right.